My name is Ignacio Cofone, and I work at McGill University. I teach privacy law and AI regulation.
And I'm François Crépeau. I also teach at the Faculty of Law at McGill. And relevant for this conversation, I was the UN Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of Migrants from 2011 to 2017.
What is AI is a complicated question because AI has been used to mean different things throughout the last couple of decades. Now, when we say AI, we almost always mean machine learning. If you go to a computer scientist and you ask them, what is AI? They will probably answer machine learning. Some of them may tell you deep learning, but most of them will tell you machine learning. Before, AI was used to mean robotics or some other form of technology. In the future, AI may turn to mean something that includes but also exceeds machine learning. AI is a term that societies have used to indicate new technologies that are usually associated with things that humans do, which is relevant to this conversation because screening for migration is something that we're used to humans doing, and now it turns out that we may have a technology that either does it or assists for it. What are the main challenges of AI? Well, it's hard to pinpoint to challenges of AI in general because there are many and they're context depending. But when used for decision making, like in this case, and this includes migration, but also, for example, finances, when we calculate someone's credit score, risk assessments in criminal law, employment opportunities, housing opportunities. Two salient risks that AI decision-making produces are the potential for discrimination and the potential for lack of transparency. The potential for discrimination is important for equality rights and also for the accuracy of the AI system that we deploy, which society has a vested interest in, and also the decision makers themselves often, not always, have a vested interest in. And transparency is important both because of the procedural rights of the decision subjects and because general transparency is helpful for members of society to identify potential dangers such as those of discrimination.
With immigration proceedings, and especially refugee status determination, two issues are key. One is evaluation of the evidence. Refugee status determination is one of the most difficult judicial decision-making process because in a normal judicial-making process, you have two sides, and hopefully you have two sides with reasonably competent lawyers who will bring issues to the fore, and then the judge will have to evaluate the wealth of evidence and make a decision. In the case of refugee status determination, essentially, in most cases, you have the story told by the claimant. And you will have, in sophisticated refugee status determination systems, you will have a database of information about the country. That will be it. And the question will very often be whether you believe the story or not. For example, if the person says that they are from this part of the Congo, but they don't speak the language of that part of the Congo, well, you have, an indication that that might not be true. You have something concrete. But very often, people will tell stories, and you have very little to evaluate. The person looks sincere. The story is relatively coherent. It's coherent with the set of facts that you find in your big database about the country, but that's all you know. That's all you have to do. So you have to check, you have to make a decision without the wealth of indications, evidence that a normal judicial system would bring forward. Many asylum seekers will tell the story that their smuggler or intermediary will tell them to tell, which doesn't mean that they're lying about their need of protection. It means that they're telling another story which was deemed to be better by the smuggler, and they're following the instruction. Another issue is that these are people with trauma, which means that the story is not always coherent. There may be parts of the story that are blocked by the brain, especially if you're in a room with several persons and you've been tortured, you've been raped, you've had beatings. You might not want to live through that trauma again, to be re-traumatized. So you will skip this, not because you want to skip this, but because your brain just makes you jump over those facts. The decision maker hears the story as it is told and has difficulty connecting. And this is already very difficult for a human being. How will a machine, and I'm asking the question to you, Ignacio, because it may be possible, because through all this process, status those who determine refugee status have all their own biases to contend with. We have stories of, for example, officers not believing the person because the woman was never looking at them in the eyes. Well, in her culture, women never look at men in the eyes. And how do you, as a Canadian, highly educated person, are going to analyze that is difficult. It's very difficult. So these are challenges in terms of appreciating or analyzing the evidence. The other element, which is key, is review of decisions. Decisions like administrative decisions like these need to be reviewed for errors of fact, in which case it's an appeal, or errors of law, in which case it's a judicial review. If I understand well, correct me if I'm wrong, you never know the reasoning that AI has followed to come to their decision. You know all the factors it's been informed with, but you don't know what reasoning the AI machine has used, in which case the person who's reviewing the decision has difficulty assessing whether the assessment of the evidence was appropriate. And that's a second separate issue.
The story that you said about people not looking at each other in the eyes and some people taking that as a sign of lying, but that being culturally dependent, and that not being a sign of lying in other cultures or other communities, translates really well, I think, to the conversation about considering different forms of machine learning to assist in these decisions. And the reason is that machine learning is often presented into decision-making such as this one with promises of neutrality. When machine learning is presented to judges, to politicians, to regulators, it is often presented with the idea of, oh, your decision makers are biases and math cannot be racist, so use machine learning instead and you will solve the biases. The problem is that, or not the problem, the limitation is that machine learning, while helpful in a huge number of contexts, can be helpful or unhelpful depending on the ways that we have to train it. And it depends on the data that we have to train it. So how would one train a machine learning algorithm to assist with believing in these stories, for example? Well, one would have to first use the stories as part of the data. Here are the stories that people tell. Here are the ways that people tell the story. So you could have, for example, a variable for looking at the eyes or not looking at the eyes. And then you have the output. And then you have whether the decision maker believed that person or didn't believe that person. If we throw all of that into a machine learning algorithm, and the machine learning algorithm sees that when people look into each other's eyes, the output is story was believed, and when people don't look at each other's eyes, the output was story was not believed. What the machine learning will tell you is that stories are not believable when people don't look at each other in the eyes. So it cannot magically overcome the biases of decision makers when the way that we have to train it is the outputs of those very decision makers. And therefore, it has somewhat of limited utility for contexts where we cannot train it with so many objective facts, but rather the opinions of all these decision makers. It can maybe assist in more specific decisions when it's not, do you believe in this story in general or do you not? It can assist, for example, in providing clearer information about how often certain facts come out that people are told to tell and they're not necessarily truthful, and maybe in that sense it will be helpful. But while it would depend on the specific model, on the specific data, on the specific way of using it, I'll be somewhat skeptical of machine learning algorithm being able to be particularly useful or a solution to this general purpose of, do we believe this person's story or not?
Yeah. Yeah. Human beings are also able to detect when a story is the 100th time that
Right.
they've heard it.
Right.
The story is such that it's manifestly being told because someone told them that this was the story that the decision maker would believe, which happens quite often for certain nationalities or certain migration routes. It doesn't mean that behind that there's not a real story.
Right.
That needs to be extracted. And often the decision makers do not make the effort of going behind that. Would a machine detecting that this is the story, this is the 100th time that the story has been told in the past 3 weeks, manifestly in the pipeline, someone is telling that to everyone. Would a machine go beyond that? Would a machine be equipped with saying, okay, I hear what you say, I don't believe it, but you might have a story behind it. What is your real story? And having the means, and I'm almost saying the psychological means of trying to extract it.
Right. Yeah. That's impossible to answer without knowing exactly what kind of technology they would be considering in deploying, how they would consider deploying it, what data would they have to train it, what kind of weights would they use. Ideally, machine learning algorithms should never be used to replace the decision makers, but rather assist them. Mm-hmm. And in some contexts, they can be helpful in assisting them, as long as we're aware of the limitations of what they can do with the data, of the potential bias that they can introduce, and so on and so forth. And another problem is that when machine learning is used to assist decision makers and not replace them, but the recommendation that it provides is a general recommendation, as opposed to a more constrained recommendation of one element of the decision-making process, then people tend to overly rely on whatever the machine says. One example that came to light, thanks to good journalism that was done about it, was a system used in a U.S. county called Allegheny to determine whether kids were high risk or low risk of so as to be taken away from their homes by public service. And they had this machine learning system, and the machine learning system gathered data from lots of past decisions of the service of which kids were taken away and which kids were not taken away, and what were all the specific characteristics of those kids. I can't remember exactly what the weights were, but they would consider a very large number of factors that would, in normal circumstances, be difficult for a human decision maker to consider individually, and then the system would provide a recommendation. The officer didn't have to follow whatever the machine learning system says, but imagine you are an overworked and overstretched public employee having to make hundreds of decisions every day, and then you get this general recommendation from the AI algorithm that you were provided with. That doesn't say you should take into account this thing, but it rather says high risk or low risk. The potential cost of deviating from whatever the machine tells you and then be wrong is quite high. And the cost of being mistaken while following the recommendation of the algorithm that you were provided is not that high. And that leads to over-reliance. And over-reliance leads to lots of problems because then you're transposing all the biases and limitations of the training data that the machine has onto the decision makers themselves, when the point of having this split system is precisely to have the decision maker rely on the machine for specific things that are hard to evaluate, but then use judgment and consider all the things that an algorithm cannot consider, such as a story, because it's qualitative, not quantitatively, such as their experience, such as the common sense, and things like that. So,
The one issue that what you just said raises is the issue of justifying a decision.
Right.
In many refugee determination systems, a positive decision will very often be justified by a few paragraphs, which is what the machine would use to learn. And it's quite small in terms of how to learn, what a positive decision is like. Negative decisions need to be much more justified, because very often they will go on appeal or they will go to judicial review, and the decision maker doesn't want to be scolded by the appeal mechanism for lack of justifications. So they're much better argued, but at the same time, they become quite standardized.
Oh, I see.
The person, I do not trust the story because the person had many holes in the story and contradicted themselves several times. And what they said when they arrived at the airport and what they said in my courtroom is actually quite different. Well, there may be explanations for all of these differences, or which may pertain to trauma, may pertain to not being prepared the first time and then having had the benefit of a lawyer afterwards, which is, what people who fight their tax assessments want to have. They want to have a lawyer that, will defend them, and we find that normal.
Right.
But we seem to not find normal that a person who arrives at the airport, blary-eyed and still traumatized, will tell a story that will be quite different from the one they will tell several months later, having been counseled properly, etc., and having remembered things, having organized their thoughts, etc. So how is the machine going to learn from those decisions, which are often quite, the reasoning is often quite poor. And so how does that translate into the machine learning from them? And I should add that some decisions are very well written.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of the Canadian case law from the Immigration and Refugee Board. Some decisions are very well written. They are the minority. Many decisions are, quite standardized. They're probably the majority. And some decisions are poorly written and are in a greater proportion than for other judicial decisions, like, in the Court of Appeal of Quebec, for example. They will be reviewed, severely reviewed in the federal courts, because and the proportion is higher.
Right.
So they're poorly written. So how do you factor in all this with the machine learning?
So most of the times the AI system, this again depends on the technology, so it's hard to make general conclusions without knowing specifically what is being discussed. But most of the times the AI systems that are used to assist in decision making don't actually learn from the reasoning of the decisions. They just learn from the output. So for example, criminal law risk assessments algorithms that are used to evaluate whether someone is high risk or low risk of recidivism for parole and bail decisions. What they look at is what are the characteristics that this person has, for example, ethnicity, gender, age, neighborhood, postal code, prior records, gang membership, and other
Education.
And they will compare those characteristics with the characteristics of other people, plus the output of they were considered by judges to be low risk or they were considered by judges to be high risk. You won't even get into the reasoning because that's hard to quantify. There could be other systems later on that do learn from the reasoning, but you would need some sort of natural language processing model, and that's not yet been used to assist in decision making. And so in some sense, it's even worse than what you're worrying about in terms of considering the reasoning and the potential exceptions.
Yeah, because if you can't go to appeal if you don't have a reasoning.
Right.
There's nothing to appeal.
Right.
You have a decision, you have a set of facts and a decision. What you can do is take a new decision with the same set of facts.
Right.
But you cannot evaluate the quality of the decision that's been taken in the first instance.
Right.
And that's a huge issue.
Yeah, and that relates to what you were saying a second ago where we're changing the batteries, about the point that we were discussing earlier on the difference between making the decision and helping make the decision. And how this blurs when the helping make the decision means giving a recommendation for the decision. So sometimes the helpful way to use the systems is, rather than giving a general recommendation to the decision maker, you should decide this, you can think about what are the aspects of the decision that decision makers have trouble with? Which of them are quantifiable? Which of them are about knowing similarities and knowing numbers and knowing more specific things that because of limited bandwidth that humans have is hard to consider? And then having or developing AI systems that can help with those specific elements of the decision rather than with the decision in general. And that reduces the automation bias of having decision makers directly rely on whatever output the AI suggests, and it could potentially help people reduce their own biases and reflect as to what they're considering the decision making, while forcing them to not substitute their judgment with the lack of judgment of the AI. The main mechanism for oversight is in some way civil society when you provide sufficient transparency. Now, what is sufficient transparency? Usually when we talk about transparency, we talk about disclosing the data that you trained a system with, the code that you use for that system, the features that the system uses to make recommendations, ideally the weights that those features have. Those would be although there are many forms of providing transparency, those would be the main ways in which if one makes a disclosure, then you could have investigative journalists, civil rights groups, auditing and evaluating the potential fairness of the system. The thing with automated decision making is that it makes it really difficult to know whether an individual decision was fair or unfair. Say that you applied for a job and you were not selected, and the employer used an AI system to screen CVs and choose who would go on the first interview. How could you possibly know if the algorithm said no to you because it has any form of bias or because you just didn't make the cut? It's impossible. So you need this aggregated type of information to identify and then potentially resolve concerns of biases, accuracy, and others that may come up, particularly for decisions such as this one.
Yeah. For an AI system to work well in refugee determination, the machine would have to learn not only from past decisions, because new events occur. And if you learn from past decision, you might miss a new event. There's always a first story of a massacre somewhere. Someone tells a story and no one believes it, and then a second person comes forward, and then a third, and then suddenly we start believing the story. But at the beginning we don't. So there is need for learning from, not simply from past decisions. Probably the machine could learn from the whole of the literature, which often decision makers don't have the time to read. They read eventually past decisions on the country that they are specialized in, but they don't necessarily read all the literature, and machine can do that. So that might be a good point for machines. If there is quite a lot of literature about this country and what happened in the past 6 months or the past 12 months, and we can have, it can take into account journalists' accounts of events happening in the past weeks, etc. Suddenly, we have a database that is available to a machine that is usually not available easily to a human. So there are elements there where I can see an advantage, the capacity to process a lot more information in a very short time. But how to deal with emotion, with trauma, is much more difficult, and how to deal with the stories, which may be haphazard, full of holes, told in a very different way, etc. That will be a lot more difficult. How to create oversight without, the natural oversight mechanism is judicial review. That's what it does, and we often have 3 levels of jurisdiction. You have a decision maker who can go, and then the person can go to federal court or federal court of appeal, and then there's the Supreme Court, which is an option if the court accepts, because we believe that these decisions, some of these decisions requires 2 more levels of jurisdiction in order to ensure that there's no error. But if the machine makes a decision, it's difficult because you don't have a reasoning. If it assists, you have the dependency path that you mentioned, the fact that humans will follow the recommendation. If it's not a recommendation, but it's only a series of facts, for example, the story conforms to the database I have in terms of what happened in the country, it's generally accurate in terms of time of year, although the dates were mixed up, etc. That could potentially be useful if it's not followed blindly by the human beings. Unfortunately, very often, and please tell me otherwise if I'm wrong, you implement machine learning in order to reduce the cost of human decision making. And so you have less human beings involved, and if you have less human beings involved, you have less oversight and less capacity for correcting biases, mistakes that the machine does.